A humble young man marries an 80-year-old millionaire. Seeking stability, he believed his future was secure. But little did he know his life was about to take a turn. The secrets. The millionaire was hiding shocked everyone. Before you hear this unmissable story, remember to subscribe to the channel. The ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria glittered with the opulence typical of New York high society events. Michael Sanders, 28 years old, adjusted his rented tuxedo tie for the 10th time while observing his now wife, Elizabeth Montgomery, 80 years old, greeting the illustrious guests at their wedding. The contrast between them could not have been more evident. She, one of the wealthiest women in the country, owner of a business empire built over decades. He, a former waiter who until 3 months ago had been serving drinks at parties like this one. The murmur of the guests was like a constant buzz in his ears. Michael knew exactly what they were saying. Another gold digger, another opportunist, another gigolo. But what no one there knew was that the agreement between him and Elizabeth had been established with crystal clarity from their first meeting. "I need companionship, Michael," she had said, her penetrating blue eyes fixed on him as she took a sip of champagne at the bar where he worked. "And you need a better life. We can help each other." The proposal came after weeks of conversations during her regular visits to the bar. Michael still remembered the day when he accidentally spilled martini on her Chanel dress. Instead of making a fuss, Elizabeth laughed, saying that had been the most spontaneous moment of her evening. From then on, she always chose to sit at the counter where he worked. Helen, Elizabeth's personal assistant, observed the party with an enigmatic expression. From the beginning, she had been the intermediary between the couple, arranging meetings, settling details, preparing Michael for his new life. There was something in her gaze that intrigued him, a mixture of melancholy and resignation that didn't match her always professional demeanor. "Mr. Montgomery," a deep voice pulled him from his thoughts. It was Charles Edwards, president of one of the largest banks in the country. "Congratulations on your marriage. Elizabeth is an extraordinary woman." Michael forced a smile. He still hadn't gotten used to the new surname or to people treating him as if he had always belonged to this world. "Thank you," he replied, trying to imitate the polite tone Helen had taught him. "Elizabeth is truly one of a kind." As the party progressed, Michael noticed something peculiar in his wife's behavior. At certain moments, she exchanged significant glances with some guests, looks that seemed to carry coded messages. One man in particular, who introduced himself only as Dr. Richard, spent several minutes in a whispered conversation with her in a corner of the ballroom. Later, when they were finally alone in their new penthouse on Park Avenue, Elizabeth seemed different. The calculated sweetness she displayed in public gave way to a coldness Michael had not yet known. "Starting tomorrow," she said, sitting in her favorite armchair with a glass of wine, "you will begin to attend board meetings. It's important that everyone sees you as part of the Montgomery family." Michael nodded, but something in her tone disturbed him. It was as if every word carried a hidden weight, a meaning he still couldn't decipher. "Helen will prepare you," Elizabeth continued. "She knows all the necessary details." That night, lying in the king-size bed of the master bedroom, Elizabeth preferred to sleep in separate quarters. Michael contemplated the marble ceiling, thinking about how his life had changed so drastically. The agreement seemed simple. He would be the devoted husband, and she would give him a life of luxury, but something in the subtext of that story was beginning to bother him. The next morning, as he came down for breakfast, he found Helen organizing a stack of documents on the dining room table. She briefly looked up, and Michael noticed something different in her gaze, a kind of silent warning that he couldn't quite understand. "These are the reports from Montgomery Enterprises," she explained, her voice controlled. "You need to know every detail before tomorrow's meeting." As he flipped through the pages, Michael noticed an old photo falling from inside a folder. It was Elizabeth, younger, next to a man who looked very much like him. On the back, a date, 1995. "What's this?" he asked, showing the photo to Helen. The assistant quickly took the photograph, her fingers trembling slightly. "Nothing important," she replied, tucking it into her purse. "Focus on the reports. Elizabeth doesn't tolerate inattention to business." That photo, however, planted a seed of unease in Michael. There was more to this story than a simple agreement between an ambitious young man and a rich widow, and he was beginning to suspect that he was about to find out what it was. The boardroom of Montgomery Enterprises occupied the entire top floor of the most imposing building on Wall Street. Michael observed, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city of New York, stretching as far as the eye could see. It was his first official meeting as a board member, and nervousness made his hands sweat. "The Montgomery Empire," Elizabeth began, her voice echoing through the black marble room, "was built on 3 pillars: loyalty, discretion, and obedience." Her eyes scanned the table, pausing for a moment on each of the 12 board members present until resting on Michael. "My husband is now part of this family, and I expect everyone to treat him as such." The young man noticed the glances exchanged between the board members. Some showed barely disguised contempt, others curiosity, and some, the older ones, seemed to carry an expression that mixed pity and knowledge of something he didn't know. During the presentation of the quarterly results, Michael noticed something strange in the numbers. There were subtle discrepancies, financial movements that didn't make sense to someone who, even with little experience, had spent the last few weeks obsessively studying the company's reports. "Any questions, Mr. Montgomery?" asked Dr. Richard, the same mysterious man from the wedding, who now introduced himself as the group's financial director. "Actually, yes," Michael responded, surprising everyone with his poise. "I noticed there are significant monthly transfers to a subsidiary in the Cayman Islands, but I didn't find records of this company in previous reports." A heavy silence fell over the room. Elizabeth, who until then had maintained her impassive posture, adjusted herself in her chair. For a fraction of a second, Michael saw something pass through her eyes. Concern, perhaps. "Those are strategic investments," Dr. Richard cut in quickly. "We can discuss this in private later." After the meeting, as he walked through the mirrored corridors of the building, Michael was approached by Helen. She seemed more agitated than usual. "You shouldn't have asked that question," she whispered, pulling him into an empty room. "There are things it's better not to question." "Why? What's going on here, Helen?" The assistant hesitated, her green eyes revealing an internal conflict. "Just be careful, observe more, and speak less." That night, during dinner in the penthouse, Elizabeth was especially quiet. Michael watched her methodically cut her fillet, each movement as precise and controlled as a surgery. "You surprised me today," she finally spoke, without raising her eyes from her plate. "I didn't expect so much perspicacity." "I just did." "My homework," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "After all, I'm a Montgomery now." Elizabeth raised her eyes, an enigmatic smile on her thin lips. "Yes, you are, and that means you need to learn certain peculiarities of our business." After dinner, alone in the library, Michael began a discreet investigation into his wife's past. Old newspapers showed a different Elizabeth, younger, more alive, always accompanied by different men. In a 1985 photo, she appeared with a man who couldn't have been more than 30 years old. In 1995, it was the man from the photo Helen had hidden. In 2005, another young businessman. Intrigued, Michael deepened his search. Each of these men had been introduced as a partner or director of some Montgomery Group company, and each of them had mysteriously disappeared from the business scene after a few years. A noise at the door made him quickly close the laptop. Helen was standing at the entrance, an indescribable expression on her face. "Looking for something specific?" she asked, approaching. "Just trying to better understand the company's history," he replied, keeping a casual tone. Helen came closer, lowering her voice to almost a whisper. "There are stories that aren't in the newspapers, Michael. Stories that could change everything you think you know." "What kind of stories?" She opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of Elizabeth's heels in the hallway made her quickly back away. "Tomorrow," she murmured before hurriedly leaving the library. Michael sat there in the dark while his mind tried to connect the pieces of the puzzle that was beginning to form. The Montgomery Empire seemed to have been built on secrets much deeper than he had imagined, and now he was inextricably involved in something he didn't fully understand. In the darkness of the office, the photo of Elizabeth with her former companions seemed to watch him from the computer screen, like a silent warning of what might be to come. The next morning dawned cloudy, with a typical New York drizzle falling on the penthouse windows. Michael woke up earlier than usual, his mind still processing the discoveries of the previous night. At breakfast, he found only a note from Elizabeth informing him that she had traveled for an emergency meeting in Washington, D.C. It was then that Helen appeared, carrying an old leather folder. Her eyes revealed that she hadn't slept well. "We need to talk," she said, closing the dining room door. "But not here. Meet me at the Gramercy Tavern at 11 a.m. It's important that no one sees us together." The Gramercy Tavern in the heart of Manhattan was an unlikely place for secret meetings, but perhaps that was exactly why Helen chose it. Michael arrived first, choosing a discreet table in the back of the establishment. "What I'm going to tell you," Helen began as soon as she sat down, "might seem crazy, but it's the truth, and you need to know before it's too late." She opened the folder and began to spread documents on the table. They were newspaper clippings, old photographs, and official documents, all related to Elizabeth's former husbands. Richard Mendez, 1985. Disappeared after reporting irregularities in one of the group's companies. Frank Adams, 1995. Vanished during a business trip to Europe. Alex Thompson, 2005. Abandoned everything and was never seen again. Michael felt his stomach churn as Helen continued her exposition. Each story followed a similar pattern. Ambitious young men who married Elizabeth, gained prominent positions in her companies, and eventually disappeared without a trace. "But why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Helen took a deep breath, her fingers nervously tapping on the coffee cup. "Because I can't let it happen again. And because," she hesitated, looking around before continuing, "because Elizabeth Montgomery is my mother." The revelation hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. He observed Helen more closely, noticing, for the first time, the subtle similarities, the same eye shape, the same determined chin. "She never officially recognized me," Helen continued. "I was raised by a housekeeper, always kept nearby, but never as a daughter. When I grew up, she offered me a position as her personal assistant. It was her way of keeping me under control." "But why? Why hide your own daughter?" "Because I know too much. Because I grew up seeing each of her schemes, each manipulation, each..." She paused, carefully choosing her words. "Let's say that the Montgomery Empire wasn't built solely on legitimate investments." Michael began to connect the dots. The suspicious transfers to the Cayman Islands, the glances exchanged during meetings, the disappearance of the ex-husbands. "She uses the husbands," Helen explained. "Ambitious and talented people like you, Michael. She uses their knowledge, their skills, and when they discover too much or start questioning, they disappear," Michael completed, feeling a shiver run down his spine. "Exactly. And now she's preparing you. That question you asked at the meeting, it was a test. She wants to see how far your curiosity, your intelligence goes. That's how it starts." Michael ran his hands over his face, trying to absorb it all. "And why did you decide to tell me this now?" "Because you're different," Helen replied, her eyes fixed on his. "You're not like the others who only saw the money. You have something more, something that can help us expose all of this." "Help us?" "Yes, for years I've been gathering evidence, documents, witnesses, but I never had someone on the inside to help me, someone she trusts." Helen's cell phone vibrated, making her startle. It was a message from Elizabeth, informing of her early return to New York. "We need to go," she said, quickly gathering the documents. "She can't suspect that we met." Before leaving, Helen handed Michael a flash drive. "Here's everything I've managed to gather over the years. Keep it safe, but don't access it from any computer connected to the company network. They monitor everything." Michael pocketed the flash drive, feeling its weight as if he were carrying a time bomb. As he walked back to the office, his mind was buzzing with the revelations. It was no longer just a convenience agreement with a rich widow. He was at the center of something much bigger and much more dangerous than he could have imagined. When he got home that night, he found Elizabeth sitting in her favorite armchair, sipping her usual red wine. Her smile was the same as always, but now Michael saw something different in it, something predatory, calculating. "How was your day, dear?" she asked, her mellifluous voice echoing through the room. "Quiet," he replied, forcing a smile. "Just routine work." As he went up to his room, Michael could feel Elizabeth's gaze on his back, and for the first time since the wedding, he felt true fear of what he had gotten himself into. In the weeks that followed, Michael found himself in an elaborate game of appearances. During the day, he was the dedicated executive and husband, participating in meetings, business dinners, and social events. At night, when everyone was asleep, he devoted himself to meticulously studying the documents provided by Helen. The flash drive revealed a complex web of questionable financial operations. Each ex-husband had been strategically positioned in different areas of the Montgomery Empire, always in positions that allowed them access to crucial information, and all had started asking questions shortly before their mysterious disappearances. On a particularly tense afternoon, Elizabeth called him to her private office, a room she rarely shared with anyone. "Michael, darling," she began, pouring him a glass of wine, "I'm impressed with your performance in recent weeks. Dr. Richard told me you've shown a natural talent for business." "I just try to learn as much as possible," he replied cautiously. "That's why I've decided to give you a bigger responsibility," she continued, handing him a folder. "I want you to personally oversee our international operations, starting with our branch in the Cayman Islands." It was exactly the same pattern Helen had described. Michael felt his heart race but maintained his composure. "It would be an honor," he replied, taking the folder. "When do we start?" "Next week. Helen will arrange your trip." Later that same day, Helen met him in the library. "She's following the script to the letter," she whispered after checking if they were really alone. "First the international operations, then access to offshore accounts, and then I become a problem to be solved," Michael completed. "Exactly. But we have an advantage that the others didn't have. We know what's coming." As they talked, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Helen quickly picked up some random report and began discussing it aloud, just as Elizabeth entered the library. "Good to find you two," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Helen, dear, I need you to prepare a presentation for tomorrow. Michael and I have an important dinner with some investors." After Helen left, Elizabeth approached Michael, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was cold as ice. "You know, Michael," she began, "I've always known how to choose my partners well. You have exceeded all expectations." That night, dinner was held at the most exclusive restaurant in New York. The guests were 5 austere-looking men whom Michael had never seen at regular board meetings. "These are our most discreet partners," Elizabeth introduced. "They oversee our most sensitive operations." The conversation flowed in codes and metaphors, each word loaded with hidden meanings. Michael realized he was being evaluated, tested. Each of his responses was carefully analyzed. Back at the penthouse, as Elizabeth retired to her quarters, Michael received an encrypted message from Helen. "Tomorrow, 7 a.m. Central Park. I have urgent news." The next day, even before sunrise, Michael met Helen near the Bethesda fountain. She seemed more agitated than usual. "I found something," she said, handing him a small envelope. "Photos of Elizabeth in Zurich last week, when she said she was in Washington." The photos showed Elizabeth meeting with the same men from dinner, but there was something more. Documents being exchanged, bags being delivered. "She's accelerating the process," Helen explained. "Normally, it took her months to introduce the husbands to the main scheme. With you, it's different. Faster." "Why?" "I'm not sure, but I think she suspects someone is investigating the old operations. She needs you operational as soon as possible." Michael tucked the envelope into the inner pocket of his jacket, feeling the weight of the situation. He was walking on a tightrope, and any wrong move could be fatal. "We need to act before it's too late," said Helen, her voice trembling slightly. "I have a plan, but it's risky, very risky." As the sun rose over New York, Michael realized he had reached the point of no return. It was no longer just about surviving Elizabeth's game. It was about dismantling it completely. Helen's plan was audacious and dangerous. During breakfast, while explaining the details in whispers in the penthouse garden, Michael felt his stomach churn with each new revelation. "Elizabeth keeps a secret safe in her country house in the Hamptons," Helen explained. "It's not the official safe that everyone knows about in her office. This one is different, hidden behind a false wall in the private library." "And what's inside?" "Original documents, unofficial contracts, records of all questionable operations from the last 30 years. And more importantly, evidence of the fate of each of the ex-husbands." Michael swallowed hard. "How do you know all this?" "Because I saw her storing things there for years. She never knew I discovered the safe's existence. I was very young when I found it by accident, playing hide-and-seek with the housekeeper's daughter." The plan was seemingly simple. Elizabeth had scheduled a weekend at the country house as she did every month. Michael, as a devoted husband, would accompany her. Helen would create a business emergency that would require Elizabeth's presence in New York for a few hours, giving Michael enough time to access the safe. "But how will I open it?" Helen smiled. "For the first time in days. Remember that old photo you found? The date on the back wasn't just a date, it was the safe combination." That night, during dinner, Elizabeth was especially talkative, discussing plans for the weekend. "The country house is beautiful this time of year," she commented, sipping her wine. "I've had everything prepared to receive some special friends on Saturday night." Michael noticed a significant exchange of glances between her and Helen, who was serving dessert. "What kind of friends?" he asked casually. "Oh, just some business partners. People you need to get to know better, darling. After all, you'll soon be much more involved in our special operations." Her tone made the hairs on the back of Michael's neck stand up. It was as if every word carried a veiled warning. On Friday, they left for the Hamptons. The country house, actually a mansion in European style, was even more impressive than Michael had imagined. Situated on top of a hill, it offered a privileged view of the ocean. "I'll show you to your quarters," said Elizabeth, guiding him through corridors decorated with expensive works of art. "Although I prefer that you sleep in my room this time." Michael felt his blood run cold. It was the first time she had made such a suggestion since the wedding. "Of course, dear," he replied, forcing a smile. That night, lying next to Elizabeth, Michael remained awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind was working frantically, going over every detail of the plan. Saturday dawned with a typical fog for the region. After breakfast, Elizabeth received the emergency call from Helen. "Darling, I need to resolve something in New York," she announced, visibly annoyed. "I'll be back in time for dinner with our guests." As soon as Elizabeth's helicopter took off, Michael sprang into action. The private library was on the 3rd floor, locked with an electronic security system. Helen had provided the code. Inside the room, everything exuded power and antiquity. Rare books, period furniture, and an atmosphere heavy with secrets. Following Helen's instructions, Michael located the panel that concealed the safe, N995, the numbers from the photo. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside, he found exactly what Helen had described, folders organized by date, each containing documents that could bring down the Montgomery Empire. But there was something more, something not even Helen knew, about a diary. As he quickly flipped through the yellowed pages, Michael discovered that Elizabeth meticulously documented every step of her plans. Each marriage, each operation, each disappearance. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him. As he turned, his heart nearly stopped. "Impressive," said Elizabeth, standing at the library door. "You've gotten further than any of them." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael remained motionless, the diary still in his hands, as Elizabeth observed him with an expression that mixed admiration and danger. "You know," she began, walking slowly through the library. I always knew Helen harbored some resentment, but I confess I didn't expect her to be so creative. You knew? Asked Michael, his voice firmer than he expected. Darling, I know everything that happens in my empire, Elizabeth replied, sitting elegantly in a leather armchair, including your secret meetings, the Gramercy Tavern. An interesting choice. I must admit, Michael felt the blood freeze in his veins. The entire plan, all the precautions, had been in vain. Elizabeth was always one step ahead. What intrigues me, she continued, is why you didn't run when Helen told you about the others. Any sensible person would have disappeared at the first opportunity. Maybe I'm not sensible, he replied, beginning to regain his composure. Elizabeth laughed, a melodious sound that echoed off the book-lined walls. No, you're much more than that. You're ambitious, intelligent, and above all courageous, exactly the type of person I look for. To later make disappear? Oh no, Michael. You're different. You always were. From the first moment I saw you, in that bar, I knew you'd be special. She stood up, approaching him with the grace of a predator. The others were weak. They discovered the truth and panicked, threatened to expose everything. You faced the danger head-on. What happened? To them, Elizabeth? Asked Michael, holding the diary firmly. Let's say they chose a less lucrative path, but you have the chance to make a different choice. At that moment, the library door opened again. Helen entered, but she wasn't alone. Dr. Richard and 2 of the men from the mysterious dinner accompanied her. I'm sorry, Michael, said Helen, her voice trembling. She discovered everything. Actually, dear, Elizabeth corrected, I always knew. Just as I always knew you're my daughter. The key revelation made Helen stagger. You knew? A mother always knows, doesn't she? I kept you close all these years, not out of guilt or obligation, but because I saw in you the same thing I see in Michael, potential. Elizabeth walked to a side table and poured herself a glass of wine. Now, we have a decision to make, a decision that will affect all of our futures. What decision? Asked Michael, exchanging a quick glance with Helen. You can join me, truly, not as pawns, but as partners. Helen, as my legitimate heir, and you, Michael, as the executor. I've always dreamed of having. And if we refuse? Challenged Helen. Elizabeth's smile disappeared. Then we'll have to follow the usual protocol, and it would be a shame to waste so much talent. Michael looked at the diary in his hands, then at Helen, and finally at Elizabeth. Years of manipulation, secrets, and absolute power had transformed that woman into something beyond normal comprehension. Do you really think you can continue controlling everything and everyone? He asked. I don't think, darling, I know. The question is, do you want to be on the winning side, or would you prefer to be another footnote in the Montgomery family history? The air in the library became heavy with the weight of the impending decision. Michael and Helen found themselves at an impasse that neither had foreseen. The choice they would make at that moment was not just about their lives, but about the future of an empire built on secrets and unbridled ambitions. The sun was beginning to set in the Hamptons, painting the library with orange hues that contrasted with the tension of the moment. Michael was still holding the diary, his fingers pressing the leather cover as if his life depended on it. You have 10 minutes to decide, announced Elizabeth, walking towards the door. Dr. Richard and our friends will stay here to ensure the conversation is productive. As soon as Elizabeth left, Helen approached Michael, her hands trembling slightly. She's playing with us, she whispered, as she's always done with everyone. Dr. Richard cleared his throat, maintaining a respectful but vigilant distance. If I may offer some advice, he said, surprising the two with his almost paternal tone. There's more at stake here than you imagine. Michael studied the face of the man who had always seemed to be just another of Elizabeth's pawns. There was something different in his expression now, a mixture of weariness and regret. What do you mean? Asked Michael. Why do you think I'm still alive after so many years working for her? Richard replied with a question. Because I understood something that others didn't understand. Elizabeth Montgomery isn't just a person, she's a force of nature. Fighting her is like trying to stop an avalanche with your bare hands. Helen stepped forward, her green eyes shining with a new understanding. You've been helping her all these years. To ensure things didn't get completely out of control, Richard completed, someone needed to be there to soften the consequences. Michael quickly flipped through the diary, finding mentions of Richard in several passages. He was right. While other executives came and went, Richard remained a constant, apparently loyal but secretly acting as a kind of invisible moderator. The other husbands, Michael began, They're alive, Richard answered, in a low voice. Relocated with new identities, it was the most I could do for them. The revelation hit Helen like lightning. So all this time, your father is alive, Helen, Richard confirmed. Alex Thompson lives in Portugal under another name. He tried to make contact several times, but Elizabeth always intercepted the messages. Silent tears began to roll down Helen's face. Her entire life had been built on an even bigger lie than she had imagined. Why are you telling us this now? Questioned Michael. Because you're different. For the first time, Elizabeth has found her equal. In you, Michael, and her own daughter. She sees this even if she doesn't admit it. That's why she's offering a true partnership, not just a place on her chessboard. The minutes were passing. Quickly, Michael and Helen exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. And if we accept, asked Helen, how can we be sure it's not another of her manipulations? Richard smiled sadly. You can't, but you can use this to your advantage. Accept the offer, truly gain her trust, and then... We change the game from the inside, Michael completed, beginning to understand. The sound of Elizabeth's heels echoed down the hallway, announcing her return. Michael quickly returned the diary to the safe, closing it carefully. When Elizabeth entered the library again, she found Michael and Helen standing side by side, with determined expressions on their faces. So, she asked, raising a perfectly arched eyebrow. We accept, Michael replied, his voice firm, but with one condition. Oh, Elizabeth seemed genuinely intrigued. And what would that be? Total transparency from now on. Among all of us, said Helen, stepping forward. If we're going to be a real family, we need to act like one. Elizabeth studied the two for a long moment, her face an impenetrable mask. Finally, a slow smile formed on her lips. Interesting, she murmured. Very interesting indeed. The days that followed the confrontation in the library were a complex dance of power and adaptation. Elizabeth, true to her word of transparency, or at least her version of it, began to include Michael and Helen in all the main operations of the Montgomery Empire. On a particularly busy morning, the three found themselves in the main meeting, room of the New York office, reviewing documents that were previously strictly confidential. As you can see, Elizabeth explained, sliding her elegant fingers over a pile of contracts, our international operations are more diversified than they appear. Michael studied the numbers carefully, noticing patterns that didn't make sense before. These companies in Switzerland, he commented, are they all fronts for capital movement? Precisely, Elizabeth replied, with a glint of approval in her eyes. Helen, dear, show him the records from the 90s. Helen, who in recent weeks had assumed a more assertive posture, brought a new folder. Her relationship with Elizabeth oscillated between moments of genuine closeness and veiled distrust. This is when everything started to take shape, said Helen, her professional voice masking her conflicting emotions. It was at this time that I met your father, Elizabeth completed, surprising everyone with her frankness. Alex was brilliant with numbers. He knew exactly how to structure complex operations without leaving traces. The silence that followed was loaded with tension. It was the first time Elizabeth had mentioned Alex voluntarily. Why him? Asked Helen, her voice barely containing the emotion. Why send him away if he was so valuable? Elizabeth stood up, walking to the window that offered a panoramic view of the city. Because he discovered something he shouldn't have. Something about my own past, about how I built all of this from the beginning. Michael and Helen exchanged significant glances. Dr. Richard, who was sitting silently in a corner of the room, adjusted himself in his chair. "And what did he discover?" Michael ventured. Elizabeth turned, her penetrating blue eyes fixed on the three. "That I also had to disappear once. That the real Elizabeth Montgomery died a long time ago, and I assumed her identity." The revelation fell like a bomb in the room. Helen brought her hands to her mouth while Michael tried to process the information. "Then who are you really?" asked Helen, her voice trembling. "That, my dear daughter, is something we need to discuss in private. But I can assure you that your father is safe, and that everything I did was to protect this empire and you." Dr. Richard cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Perhaps it's time to bring Alex back," he suggested, his voice calm but firm. Elizabeth considered the suggestion for a moment. "Not yet," she finally replied. "First, we need to ensure that Michael and Helen fully understand how our system works, and more importantly, we need to make sure they are truly capable of keeping our secrets." "How can we prove that?" questioned Michael. An enigmatic smile appeared on Elizabeth's lips. "I have a special task for you two. Something that will test not only your loyalty, but also your ability to think like true Montgomerys." She sat down again, picking up a red folder that was separate from the others. "We have a problem with one of our main competitors. Valencia Enterprises is about to close a deal that could seriously compromise our interests in the international market." "And what do you want us to do?" asked Helen. "I want you two to take control of this operation. Use all necessary resources, all the contacts I've established over the years. Show me that you're capable of protecting what I've built." Michael took the folder, feeling its weight, both literal and metaphorical. It was a test, clearly, but also an opportunity, a chance to prove his worth and perhaps gain enough leverage to start changing the rules of the game. "When do we start?" he asked, exchanging a complicit look with Helen. "Immediately," Elizabeth replied. "And remember, at this level of the game, there's no margin for error." The temporary office that Michael and Helen set up for the Valencia operation was located in a discreet building in downtown Manhattan. Maps, charts, and photos covered the walls, forming a complex web of information. "So, what do we know about Valencia Enterprises?" asked Michael, marking points on one of the maps. Helen, furiously typing on her laptop, replied without taking her eyes off the screen. "Family business. 3 generations. The current CEO, Carlos Valencia, took over 5 years ago after his father's supposed retirement. But, Michael encouraged, but there are rumors that the father, Robert Valencia, still pulls the strings behind the scenes, and he has an interesting history with Elizabeth." Michael approached, intrigued. "What kind of history?" Helen turned the laptop screen, showing an old photo. In it, a young Elizabeth, or whoever she was before assuming that identity, smiled next to a middle-aged man. Robert Valencia was Elizabeth's first major partner when she started expanding the business, and from what I've been able to discover, it was he who taught her many of the unconventional methods she uses to this day. "So we're dealing with Elizabeth's mentor," Michael murmured, the gravity of the situation becoming even clearer. In the days that followed, Michael and Helen dove deep into the operation. Using the contacts and resources provided by Elizabeth, they mapped every aspect of Valencia Enterprises, their finances, contracts, partnerships, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities. A week later, during one of their nightly meetings, Helen made a crucial discovery. "Michael, look at this," she called, pointing to the screen. "The deal that Valencia is about to close? It's with a shell company that belongs to one of Elizabeth's old partners." "That doesn't make sense," Michael replied, frowning. "Why would Elizabeth oppose a deal that, in the end, would benefit someone from her circle?" It was then that the realization hit them simultaneously. Elizabeth wasn't just testing their skills and loyalty, she was using them to neutralize an internal threat. "She's playing on multiple boards," Helen concluded, a mixture of admiration and concern in her voice. Michael leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "The question is, how do we proceed now? If we prevent the deal, we'll potentially be harming someone who could be an ally against Elizabeth in the future. But if we don't, We fail the test and lose the trust we've gained, Helen. Completed. The dilemma consumed them for hours. Eventually, after much discussion and analysis, they reached a bold decision. The next morning, they presented themselves in Elizabeth's office with a detailed plan. Instead of simply preventing the deal, Michael explained, presenting a series of documents, we propose a hostile takeover of Valencia Enterprises. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Continue. Helen took the floor. Using the information we've gathered, we can pressure Carlos Valencia to sell. Simultaneously, we would negotiate with Robert Valencia behind the scenes, offering him a consulting position in the Montgomery Group. This way, Michael concluded, we not only eliminate the Valencia threat, but we also bring to our side someone with deep knowledge of Elizabeth's operations, a valuable asset for the future. Elizabeth observed them in silence for long moments, her face an impenetrable mask. Finally, a slow smile formed on her lips. Impressive, she said, standing up. You not only completed the task, but elevated it to a new level. I'm proud. The compliment, although welcome, carried a weight that both Michael and Helen felt deeply. They had proven their worth, but at what cost? Proceed with the plan, Elizabeth ordered. And Michael, dear. Yes? When everything is finalized, I'd like you to personally conduct the negotiations with Robert Valencia. I'm sure he'll be fascinated to meet the new face of the Montgomerys. As they left Elizabeth's office, Michael and Helen exchanged meaningful looks. They had entered deeper into Elizabeth's game of power and manipulation. The question now was, could they maintain control of their own moves, or would they end up becoming pieces on someone else's board? The Valencia mansion, situated in an upscale neighborhood of New York, exuded an aura of power and tradition. Michael adjusted his tie as the driver opened the car door. Helen, who had insisted on accompanying him, gave one last encouraging look before he got out. Remember, she whispered, we're playing Elizabeth's game, but with our own rules. Michael nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. As he approached the entrance, he was greeted by an austere-looking butler. Mr. Montgomery, I presume, said the man. Mr. Valencia awaits you in the study. Following the butler through the ornate corridors, Michael couldn't help but notice the similarities with Elizabeth's house decor. It was as if the past and present were merging before his eyes. Robert Valencia was standing by the window when Michael entered. At 70 years old, the man still emanated an aura of authority that made Michael immediately understand why Elizabeth considered him a mentor. So, Robert began, turning slowly, you're Elizabeth's new toy. Michael maintained his composure, remembering Helen's advice to never show weakness. I prefer to consider myself a business partner, Mr. Valencia. Robert laughed, a low and deep sound. Partner? My young man, no one is Elizabeth Montgomery's partner. We're all pieces on her board. Perhaps, Michael replied, sitting in the chair indicated by Robert, but some pieces can change the rules of the game. Robert's eyes sparkled with interest. Interesting. You remind me of her, you know, when she was younger, full of ambition and ideas. You knew her before she became Elizabeth Montgomery? Robert poured himself a whiskey, offering another to Michael, who politely declined. Ah, so she shared that little secret with you? Fascinating. Actually, Michael corrected, she only mentioned that she assumed Elizabeth's identity. The details are still a mystery. As is everything that involves her, Robert murmured more to himself than to Michael. He sat down, studying the young man in front of him. What exactly did you come here to do, Mr. Montgomery? Because I'm sure it's not just to discuss the acquisition of my company. Michael took a deep breath, deciding to risk everything. I came to understand, to learn, and perhaps to propose an alliance. Robert raised an eyebrow. An alliance? Against Elizabeth? Not necessarily against her, Michael explained, carefully choosing his words, but to ensure that the empire she built, that you built together, isn't lost in games of power and manipulation. The old businessman remained silent for a long moment, contemplating Michael's words. Finally, he stood up and walked to a painting, on the wall. When he moved it, he revealed a built-in safe. "You know, young man," he said as he turned the combination dial, "Elizabeth wasn't the only one to keep records over the years." He took an old folder from the safe and handed it to Michael. "Here's everything you need to know about Elizabeth Montgomery's beginnings, about who she was before and how she became who she is today." Michael took the folder with trembling hands. "Why are you giving me this?" Robert sat back down, an enigmatic smile on his lips. "Because, like you, I also want to change the rules of the game. And perhaps together we can do that without destroying everything that's been built." As he flipped through the documents, Michael felt the weight of history in his hands. Photos of a young woman he barely recognized as Elizabeth. Identity. Documents with different names, records of suspicious transactions dating back decades. "Does she know you have this?" Michael asked. "She suspects," Robert replied. "That's why our recent disagreement wasn't a surprise. Elizabeth always knew I could be both her greatest ally and her worst enemy." Michael closed the folder, his mind working quickly. "And now?" "Now, my young friend, you have a choice to make. You can use this information to try to bring Elizabeth down, or you can use it to negotiate a new order, one where power is shared, not concentrated." Standing up, Michael extended his hand to Robert. "I think we have a lot to discuss, Mr. Valencia." Robert shook Michael's hand firmly. "Yes, we do, and please call me Robert. After all, if we're going to rewrite the rules of this game, we'd better start as equals." As he left the Valencia mansion, Michael found Helen anxiously waiting in the car. Her face lit up when she saw the folder in his hands. "Did you get it?" she asked, barely containing her excitement. Michael nodded, a mix of determination and apprehension in his gaze. "Yes, but this is just the beginning. We have a long road ahead." As the car drove away, Michael couldn't help but think that, for the first time since he entered this dangerous game, he finally had enough cards to change the course of the match. Michael's apartment had been transformed into an improvised operations center. Papers, photos, and documents covered every available surface, forming a mosaic of secrets and revelations. Helen, sitting on the floor amidst piles of files, avidly read each page of the folder provided by Robert Valencia. "This is unbelievable," she murmured, raising her eyes to Michael, who was pacing back and forth, absorbing each new piece of information. Elizabeth Montgomery, or rather Eliza Rodriguez, was a bankrupt young entrepreneur when she met the real Elizabeth. Michael stopped, picking up an old photo. In it, two women smiled at the camera. One was clearly the Elizabeth he knew, younger, but unmistakable. The other, the real Elizabeth, he said, pointing to the other woman in the photo. According to these documents, she was the heiress to a small fortune but suffered from a terminal illness. Helen nodded, flipping through more papers. Eliza, desperate and in debt, proposed a deal. She would take care of Elizabeth in her last months, of life in exchange for assuming her identity and fortune after her death. And Robert, Michael questioned. Apparently, he was the lawyer who structured the entire legal agreement, Helen replied. That's how he and Eliza, now Elizabeth, began their partnership. Michael sat down, trying to process it all. So, the woman we know, the powerful Elizabeth Montgomery, built this entire empire based on a fraud? A brilliant fraud, Helen corrected, a mix of admiration and revulsion in her voice. She not only assumed the identity, but multiplied the original fortune dozens of times. At the cost of how many lives? Michael pondered, remembering the disappeared ex-husbands, the suspicious operations, the secrets buried over decades. The silence that followed was interrupted by the ring of Helen's cell phone. It was a message from Elizabeth, summoning them for an urgent meeting. She knows, Helen said, fear evident in her eyes. Somehow she found out about our meeting with Robert. Michael took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. No, if she knew, she wouldn't call us for a meeting. She would act immediately. So what do? We play her game, Michael replied, a plan forming in his mind, but this time with our own cards up our sleeve. Hours later, they entered Elizabeth's office, each carrying a folder with carefully selected documents, a mix of real information and fabricated data about the Valencia operation. Elizabeth greeted them with her usual enigmatic smile, but there was an underlying tension in her behavior that didn't go unnoticed. So she began, indicating for them to sit. How was the meeting with Robert? Michael kept his expression neutral. Productive. He's receptive to the idea of a strategic partnership. Partnership? Elizabeth questioned, her voice sharp. I thought the order was for a hostile takeover. Circumstances changed, Helen intervened, her voice firmer than she felt. We believe an alliance with the Valencias might be more beneficial in the long run. Elizabeth studied them for a long moment, her penetrating blue eyes searching for any sign of betrayal. And what exactly did Robert offer for this alliance? It was at this moment that Michael decided to risk everything. He opened his folder and placed a photo on the table, not the compromising photo of Elizabeth and her predecessor, but a recent one of Robert with other influential businessmen. Access, Michael replied, to networks and connections that even you, Elizabeth, don't fully possess. The surprise on Elizabeth's face was momentary but noticeable. She picked up the photo, studying it carefully. Interesting, she murmured. And what do you propose? Helen took the floor, presenting a detailed plan for merging certain sectors of Montgomery and Valencia companies. It was a brilliant plan, which they had actually elaborated as an alternative scenario, but now served perfectly as a smokescreen. As Helen spoke, Michael closely observed Elizabeth. He could see the gears turning in her mind, assessing risks, calculating gains. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Elizabeth smiled. Impressive, she said. You two have exceeded my expectations. Perhaps it's time to expand your roles in the company. Michael and Helen exchanged quick glances, hardly believing what they were hearing. What do you have in mind? Michael asked cautiously. Elizabeth stood up, walking to the window. Michael, I want you to take over the Vice Presidency of International Operations. Helen, you'll be the new Director of Corporate Strategy. The offer was tempting, putting them in positions of real power within the Montgomery Empire, but both knew it was also Elizabeth's move to keep them under her control. It's an honor, Michael replied, measuring each word. But before we accept, we'd like to discuss some details about the company's governance structure. Elizabeth turned, an eyebrow arched. Details? Yes, he continued, feeling his heart race. We believe that for the good of the company, it's time to establish a more diversified board with independent voices. The silence that followed was tense. Elizabeth studied them, her eyes narrowing slightly. I see, she finally said. It seems our conversation will be longer than I imagined. As Elizabeth sat down again, preparing for what would undoubtedly be an intense negotiation, Michael and Helen knew they were entering dangerous territory. The game had changed, and the stakes had never been higher. The tension in Elizabeth's office was palpable. Michael and Helen were seated on one side of the imposing mahogany desk, while the matriarch of the Montgomery Empire observed them with a mix of curiosity and caution from the other side. A diversified board, Elizabeth repeated, savoring the words as if they were a fine wine. Interesting proposal, and who would you suggest to compose this board? Michael exchanged a quick glance with Helen before responding. We thought of a balanced mix, some names from the financial market, corporate governance experts, and of course Robert Valencia. Robert's name made Elizabeth adjust in her chair, an almost imperceptible movement, but one that didn't go unnoticed by Michael. Robert, she murmured, you two seem to have developed a surprising affinity with him in such a short time. Helen decided to intervene. It's a matter of strategy, Mother. Robert's experience, combined with our new ideas, could propel the Montgomery Group to new heights. Elizabeth stood up, walking slowly around the desk. New ideas, she repeated, stopping behind Michael and Helen. Like the ideas you found in that folder Robert gave you. The shock on Michael and Helen's faces was instantaneous. Elizabeth laughed softly. Did you really think you could deceive me, that I wouldn't know every move, every conversation, every revelation? Michael recovered first. So you knew all along? Of course I did, Elizabeth replied, returning to her chair. The question is, what do you intend to do with that information? It was at this moment that Michael realized they were exactly where Elizabeth wanted them. She wasn't cornered. She was in control, as she always had been. We don't want to destroy what you've built, he said, deciding to play open. We want to transform it into something better, more transparent. Transparent? Elizabeth almost spat the word. The business world isn't transparent, Michael. It's a game of shadows, of power and manipulation. It doesn't have to be that way, Helen argued, her voice laden with emotion. We can change the rules, create a legacy that doesn't depend on secrets and threats. Elizabeth studied them for a long moment, her face an impenetrable mask. Then, to the surprise of both, she smiled. You two are truly extraordinary, she said, a touch of pride in her voice. Exactly what I expected when I started this. Test. Test? Michael questioned, confused. Yes, my dear. All of this, the Valencia operation, the meeting with Robert, the revelations about my past, was an elaborate test, to see if you had what it takes not just to play the game, but to change it. Helen and Michael exchanged astonished looks. Everything they had been through, all the discoveries and plans, had been orchestrated by Elizabeth from the beginning. But why? Helen asked, her voice trembling. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, her gaze softening for the first time. Because it's time. Time to pass the baton, to see the empire I built evolve, and you two have proven to be the only ones capable of doing that. So, what happens now? Michael questioned, still trying to process everything. Now, Elizabeth replied, an enigmatic smile on her lips. We begin to rewrite the rules. Together. She opened a drawer and pulled out a document, placing it on the table in front of them. This is the new statute of the Montgomery Group. It incorporates many of the ideas you proposed, including the diversified board, but it also maintains necessary safeguards. Michael and Helen read the document, their eyes widening at the implications. It was a perfect fusion between their visions of change and Elizabeth's pragmatic wisdom. This is incredible, Helen murmured. It's the future, Elizabeth corrected. Our future, if you're willing to accept it. Michael looked at Helen, seeing in her the same mix of emotions he felt: surprise, admiration, and above all, determination. We're in, he replied, extending his hand to Elizabeth. As she shook Michael's hand and then Helen's, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: genuine hope for the future of her empire. Welcome, she said, to the new era of the Montgomerys. Outside the office, the sun was setting over New York, casting a golden glow over the skyscrapers. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another, one in which secrets of the past would transform into foundations for a brighter and perhaps fairer future. The months that followed Elizabeth's revelation were an emotional roller coaster for Michael and Helen. The implementation of the new Montgomery Group statute brought challenges that tested not only their business skills, but also their integrity and relationship. On a sunny spring morning, the three met in the panoramic penthouse of the Montgomery building, preparing for the first meeting of the new diversified board. Nervous? Elizabeth asked, adjusting her impeccable tailored suit. Helen took a deep breath, looking at the city stretching below. A little. It's a big responsibility. Michael, who was studying some last-minute documents, looked up. It's more than responsibility. It's a chance to really make a difference. Elizabeth smiled, a gesture that now seemed more genuine than ever. So you're ready. More than I ever was when I took control. The meeting room was full when they entered. Familiar and new faces mixed, long-time Montgomery Group executives, newly hired corporate governance experts, and of course, Robert Valencia, strategically seated next to an empty chair, clearly reserved for Elizabeth. Michael and Helen took their places to Elizabeth's right and left, symbolizing the new hierarchy of the company. The murmur ceased when Elizabeth stood up to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice firm and clear, today marks the beginning of a new era for the Montgomery Group, an era of transparency, innovation, and shared responsibility. Elizabeth continued her speech, Michael observed the reactions around the table. Some seemed enthusiastic, others cautious, and some, especially the older executives, visibly uncomfortable with the change. Helen took the floor next, presenting the new social and environmental responsibility projects that would be the flagship of the new management. Her passion was evident, and Michael couldn't help but feel proud seeing how she had grown in recent months. When it was his turn, Michael presented the new governance and compliance guidelines. "It won't be an easy transition," he admitted, "but it's necessary. The business world is changing and we need to change with it." The meeting extended for hours with heated debates and difficult decisions being made. By the end, even the most skeptical seemed, if not fully convinced, at least willing to give the new approach a chance. After the other board members left, Elizabeth, Michael, Helen and Robert remained in the room. "Well," said Robert, pouring himself a glass of water, "that was interesting." Elizabeth laughed, a sound that Michael and Helen were still getting used to hearing. "Interesting is a polite way of saying chaotic, isn't it, old friend?" Robert shrugged, a smile playing on his lips. "Chaos is sometimes necessary for growth. You two," he turned to Michael and Helen, "did extraordinarily well." "Thank you," Helen replied, blushing slightly at the compliment, "but we still have a long way to go." "And many secrets to unearth," Michael added, his tone more serious. Elizabeth observed them for a moment, her expression softening. "Yes, we do, and you'll have access to all of them. But remember, some secrets exist for a reason. The art is in knowing which ones should come to light and which should remain in the shadows. For now." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of that responsibility. "And what about the others?" he asked, referring to the disappeared ex-husbands. "I've already initiated the process to bring them back," Elizabeth replied. "It will be complicated, but necessary." Helen felt tears forming in her eyes. "My father—" "Yes, dear." Elizabeth placed a hand over Helen's. "Alex will be the first. He deserves to know the incredible woman you've become." The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Dr. Richard carrying a stack of documents. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but we have an urgent situation. With our subsidiary in Argentina." Michael and Helen stood up immediately, ready for action. Elizabeth observed them with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. "Go," she said. "Show them how the new Montgomerys handle crises." As Michael and Helen hurriedly left the room, discussing strategies, Elizabeth turned to Robert. "They are extraordinary," he commented. "Yes, they are," Elizabeth agreed, "and they are the future I always dreamed of for this empire." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Even if that future is different from what you built." Elizabeth looked out the window, observing the city that for so long had been her personal chessboard. "Especially because it's different," she replied, an enigmatic smile on her lips. "After all, true legacy isn't about replicating the past, but inspiring a better future." JFK International Airport was exceptionally busy that Sunday morning. Helen walked back and forth in the arrival area, her hands trembling slightly as she held a small sign with the name Alex Thompson. Michael, standing beside her, tried to calm her. "Everything will be fine," he said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "What if he doesn't recognize me?" Helen asked, anxiety evident in her voice. "What if he doesn't want to see me?" Before Michael could answer, the arrivals board announced the landing of the flight from Lisbon. Helen's heart raced. Elizabeth, who was observing the scene from a discreet distance, adjusted her dark glasses. For the first time in decades, she felt an emotion she had long buried: nervousness. The minutes that followed seemed like an eternity. Passengers began to exit through the arrival gate, some tired, others excited, families reuniting with hugs and smiles. And then he appeared. Alex Thompson, at 58, still maintained the elegant posture that characterized him 2 decades ago. His now gray hair and some lines of expression were the only visible signs of the passage of time. His eyes, the same intense green as Helen's, scanned the hall until they fixed on the small sign. Time seemed to freeze when their gazes met. Helen, unable to contain herself, let the sign fall and ran towards her father. "Helen!" Alex's voice trembled, recognition and emotion mixing in his tone. "Dad," was all Helen managed to say before throwing herself into his arms. The hug that followed was loaded with years of longing, unasked questions and unspoken words. Michael observed the scene, moved, while Elizabeth, still at a distance, discreetly removed her glasses to wipe away a stubborn tear. When they finally separated, Alex held Helen's face between his hands, studying every detail. "You're the image of your mother," he said, smiling through tears. Helen laughed, a sound mixed with sobs. "I have so much to tell you, so many questions." "And we'll have time for all of that," Alex assured, before his gaze fixed on something behind Helen. His expression changed subtly. Elizabeth had approached, stopping a few meters away. The air between them was charged with history and complex emotions. "Alex," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Elizabeth," he replied, his tone neutral but not hostile. Michael stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Michael. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." Alex shook the offered hand, studying the young man with interest. "You must be the new husband." "Not exactly," Michael corrected, casting a quick glance at Helen. "It's complicated." "I imagine so," Alex murmured, a slight smile on his lips. "Nothing is simple when it comes to the Montgomerys." The group headed towards the exit of the airport, the air between them charged with tension and expectation. On the way to the limousine that awaited them, Alex approached Elizabeth. "Why now?" he asked in a low voice. "After all these years?" Elizabeth looked at Michael and Helen, who were walking ahead, talking animatedly. "Because it's time to fix the mistakes of the past, and because they deserve the truth. All of it." Alex nodded slowly. "And are you prepared for that? To reveal everything?" "No," Elizabeth admitted, "but it's necessary. For their sake, for the Empire, and for our legacy." As they entered the car, Michael couldn't help but notice the dynamic between Elizabeth and Alex. There was a history there, complex and deep, that went far beyond the cold business records he had studied. The journey to the Montgomery mansion was filled with cautious conversations, carefully crafted questions, and measured answers. It was evident that everyone was walking on eggshells, trying to find a balance in this new reality. Upon arrival, they were greeted by Robert Valencia, who was waiting at the entrance. "Welcome back, old friend," he said, embracing Alex. "Robert," Alex replied, returning the hug, "I see you're still the faithful squire." "Someone needs to keep things in order," Robert joked, before his tone became more serious. "We have a lot to discuss." The group entered the mansion, each carrying the weight of decades of secrets, lies, and difficult decisions. But there was also hope in the air. The hope that perhaps with honesty and courage, they could not only repair the damages of the past, but build a better future. As they headed to the living room, Michael and Helen exchanged glances. They knew that the next hours, or perhaps days, would be intense and potentially painful. But they also knew it was a necessary step to truly transform the Montgomery legacy. The real journey, they realized, was just beginning.